The date was July 27th, 1794, and the most feared man in France was about to experience terror, unlike anything he had ever inflicted upon others. Maximilien Robespierre, the architect of revolutionary bloodshed, the man whose signature had condemned thousands to the guillotine, was living his final 24 hours on Earth. But what transpired during those last moments of his existence was so brutal, so psychologically devastating, that it makes every execution he ordered pale in comparison. You think you know the story of Robespierre's downfall. The history books paint it as political theatre, a swift reversal of fortune in the halls of power. But they sanitize the horror. They gloss over the psychological torment, the physical agony, and the complete destruction of a human being who had become something far worse than the monsters he claimed to fight. What actually happened during his final day alive reveals the true cost of absolute power and the inevitable justice that awaits those who feast on human suffering. This is not just the story of a tyrant's execution. This is the anatomy of terror consuming itself, the moment when revolutionary justice turned its machinery upon its own creator. The man who had perfected the art of state-sponsored murder was about to discover what it felt like to be hunted, betrayed, and systematically destroyed by the very system he had built. His final hours would prove that sometimes the most poetic justice comes not from divine intervention, but from the simple physics of power collapsing upon itself. The morning began like any other for the man they called the Incorruptible. But by 9 o'clock, Robespierre was climbing the rostrum of the National Convention with hands that trembled in a way no one had ever witnessed before. For 2 agonizing hours, he delivered what would become his political suicide note disguised as a speech. His voice, usually commanding and precise, cracked with paranoid rambling about enemies lurking in shadows and conspiracies threatening the Republic. But something fundamental had shifted in the man who had once held absolute sway over French politics. The deputies watching him recognized weakness like sharks, sensing blood in water. Every word he spoke dug his grave deeper. He spoke of plots and corruption, of threats to public liberty. But when pressed to name his enemies, he faltered. This was his fatal miscalculation. Every single deputy sitting in that chamber understood that their own name might be on his unspoken list. The speech dragged on endlessly, a rambling confession of paranoia that exposed the rotting mind behind the revolutionary facade. Deputies shifted uncomfortably as they watched the man who had terrorized them for months transform before their eyes into something pathetic and desperate. The controlled orator who had sent Marie Antoinette to her death, who had orchestrated the execution of his former allies, was unraveling in real time. When he finally concluded to scattered, half-hearted applause, the silence that followed was more damning than any accusation. This was not the thunderous approval he had grown accustomed to receiving. This was the sound of power evaporating in an instant. One by one, his former supporters rose to destroy him with the same ruthless efficiency he had taught them. Tallien branded him a dictator. Billaud Varennes accused him of tyranny. These were not his enemies speaking, but his own disciples turning against their master. Barrère, who had been his propaganda minister, delivered the coup de grâce with surgical precision. The man who had made a career of accusing others now found himself in the dock, facing the very machinery of destruction he had perfected. The chamber exploded in approval as deputy after deputy rose to condemn the man who had condemned so many others. His power base collapsed with the speed of a controlled demolition. Men who had followed him through months of bloodshed suddenly discovered courage they never knew they possessed. The fear that had kept them silent was replaced by the intoxicating realization that the monster was mortal after all. When Robespierre attempted to defend himself, his voice simply vanished. The man whose words had been weapons of mass destruction found himself literally speechless. His throat constricted, as if the ghosts of his victims were strangling him from beyond the grave. The irony was crushing and immediate. The orator who had talked his way to absolute power could no longer speak. The vote for his arrest passed by an overwhelming majority. Only scattered protests from his most devoted followers broke the chorus of condemnation. Saint-Just, his closest ally, rose to defend him but was shouted into silence. Couthon, paralyzed in his wheelchair, begged for mercy that would never come. The inner circle of the terror had just become its newest victims, and everyone in that chamber understood the historical significance of what was unfolding. But the real horror was just beginning. By 2 p.m, news of the arrest had reached the Paris Commune, Robespierre's most loyal power base. These were the men who controlled the streets, the municipal government that had been his sword and shield throughout the darkest days of the revolution. They refused to accept the convention's authority and dispatched armed forces to rescue their fallen leader. What followed was a civil war in miniature, fought in the heart of revolutionary Paris. Commune troops stormed the building where Robespierre was being held, overwhelming the guards in a desperate rescue mission that succeeded beyond their wildest hopes. But their victory was Pyrrhic. They had saved the man, but they had nowhere to hide him. The most recognizable face in France had become its most wanted fugitive. They transported him to the Hôtel de Ville, Paris's city hall, which instantly transformed from sanctuary into trap. The building sat exposed in the center of the city, surrounded by narrow streets that could become killing zones. There were no escape routes, no hidden passages, no back doors to freedom. They had rescued Robespierre only to lock him in an elaborate tomb. Inside the shabby office that became his final command post, Robespierre sat surrounded by perhaps 200 National Guardsmen loyal to the Commune. Outside, the convention's forces were mobilizing with the efficiency of a military machine. Thousands of troops rolled through Paris streets, cannon wheels thundering over cobblestones, creating a sound that must have echoed in his bones like approaching thunder. His followers begged him to flee the capital. Boats waited on the Seine. Horses stood ready at the city gates. But Robespierre found himself paralyzed by the very absolutism that had defined his political career. He could not compromise, could not bend, could not make the pragmatic decision that might have saved his life. He had spent so many years believing in his own revolutionary righteousness that he could not accept the possibility of defeat. The truth was simpler and more terrifying. There was nowhere to run. Every French city had its own guillotine. Every mayor knew his face. Every revolutionary tribunal had copies of his speeches. Flight would only delay the inevitable, trading a swift death for a slow one. The man who had made himself the face of revolutionary justice had made himself its inevitable target. As evening approached, the convention's forces completed their encirclement of City Hall. The building was surrounded by 6,000 men under the command of General Barras, with artillery pieces trained on every entrance. But the gunners hesitated to fire. Inside those walls lay 5 years of revolutionary records, irreplaceable documents that contained the entire administrative history of the new France. One stray cannonball could erase decades of revolutionary progress. The siege had begun, and Maximilien Robespierre was learning what it felt like to be trapped by the very forces he had unleashed upon his nation. The psychological warfare had only just begun. As darkness fell over Paris, the man who had orchestrated the systematic destruction of thousands found himself experiencing the slow burning agony of complete helplessness. Every sound outside the barricaded doors of City Hall carried the promise of death. Every footstep in the corridors could herald his final moment. The terror that Robespierre had weaponized against others now consumed him from within, eating away at his sanity like acid on flesh. Inside the makeshift fortress, his inner circle was disintegrating before his eyes. François Henriot, the commander of the Paris National Guard, and perhaps his most violent supporter, staggered through the doors in a state of complete intoxication. This was the man who had cleared the convention with cannons during previous purges, the brutal enforcer who might have been Robespierre's salvation. Instead, he arrived blindingly drunk, at the moment when clear thinking meant the difference between life and death. The sight of their commander swaying like a broken marionette shattered what remained of the defenders' morale. These men had followed Robespierre through months of bloodshed, believing in his vision of revolutionary purity. But watching Henriette stumble through strategic discussions, while enemy forces tightened their grip around the building, drove home the hopelessness of their situation. Some slipped away into Paris's maze of alleys. Others switched sides outright, calculating that survival trumped loyalty. By 8:30, the convention had deployed its ultimate weapon against the man who had perfected the art of legal murder. They declared Robespierre an outlaw, invoking an ancient mechanism that meant instant death without trial. The same legal technicality he had used to crush his enemies now pointed directly at his throat. Town criers shouted the decree through every district of Paris. Handbills appeared on every corner like a plague of paper death sentences. 15,000 livres for his head, dead or alive. Paris transformed overnight into a hunting ground where every citizen became a potential executioner. The man who had turned neighbor against neighbor, who had made denunciation a civic duty, now faced a city where his own face was worth a fortune. The streets he had once controlled through fear became his prison walls. The building that housed him continued its slow hemorrhage of supporters. By 10 o'clock, commune councillors were slithering outside doors like rats abandoning a sinking ship. Men who had sworn loyalty just hours earlier now feared association with the condemned tyrant more than they valued revolutionary brotherhood. The structure emptied section by section as guards abandoned their posts and clerks fled with whatever records they could carry. In a small office illuminated by flickering candles, Robespierre attempted to write his final letters with hands that shook like autumn leaves. Each word required tremendous effort as the reality of his situation penetrated deeper into his consciousness. Messages to his sister Charlotte, whom he would never see again. Instructions for the care of his dog Brant, who would soon be orphaned by revolution. These mundane details of a dying man's concerns revealed the human being buried beneath layers of ideological armor. He signed each letter with his full name and titles, as if the ritual of official correspondence might somehow restore the power that was bleeding away from him like water through a broken dam. His brother Augustin paced the small room like a caged predator, while Saint-Just sat in stunned silence, perhaps finally understanding that their vision of revolutionary purity would die with them. Couthon prayed in his wheelchair, seeking divine intervention that would never come. Lebas methodically cleaned his pistol, the metal gleaming in candlelight like a promise of escape. These 5 men, who had once controlled the destiny of 25 million French citizens, now waited for death in a cramped office, surrounded by the detritus of their collapsing revolution. The irony was so perfect, it felt orchestrated by some cosmic playwright with a taste for poetic justice. Just after midnight, as July 27th surrendered to July 28th, the convention's forces finally stormed City Hall. Gunfire erupted through the corridors like thunder trapped in stone. Musket volleys echoed off marble floors while the defenders fired desperate rounds before scattering like leaves before a hurricane. The assault came from 3 directions simultaneously, a coordinated attack that left no escape routes for the men who had trapped themselves in their revolutionary tomb. Lebas, unable to face capture and the humiliation that would follow, placed his pistol against his temple and pulled the trigger. His body collapsed onto a mound of papers, blood soaking through revolutionary proclamations and death warrants with grotesque symbolism. The first member of the inner circle had chosen his own ending rather than submit to the justice he had dispensed so freely to others. When the doors finally splintered under the assault, soldiers burst in to find Robespierre seated at a table with his head buried in his hands. The gunshot that shattered his jaw remains one of history's most debated moments. Some witnesses claimed he attempted suicide, but the pistol misfired, destroying his lower face instead of ending his life. Others insisted a soldier's bullet had found its mark. The truth, most likely, was a botched suicide attempt by a man who had lived his entire political career wielding words rather than weapons. The pistol, unfamiliar in his inexperienced grip, had kicked violently when fired. The ball tore through his lower jaw instead of his brain, leaving him alive but hideously wounded. The man who had sent thousands to clean deaths by guillotine now faced hours of agony with his face destroyed, unable to speak, barely able to breathe. Even in his final moments, fate denied him the mercy he had refused to show others. Augustin Robespierre, in a final act of desperate defiance, hurled himself from a window rather than face capture. Both legs shattered on impact, but he remained conscious and alive, adding his screams to the symphony of violence echoing through the building. Couthon, the paralyzed deputy who had been Robespierre's legal architect, was dragged down stone stairs like a broken doll, his wheelchair abandoned in the chaos above. Saint-Just, the young ideologue who had been called the Angel of Death, surrendered without resistance. The man who had crafted the philosophical justification for mass murder now faced the reality of his own mortality with the same passive acceptance he had demanded from his victims. The terror's inner circle had been destroyed in 15 minutes of brutal efficiency, their revolution consuming its own children with mechanical precision. They carried Robespierre through Paris streets on a stretcher, blood soaking through makeshift bandages while his shattered jaw hung loose like a broken hinge. The man who had driven France into revolutionary frenzy could barely breathe, each inhalation a struggle against the damage inflicted by his own desperation. Crowds gathered in the pre-dawn darkness to witness the tyrant's suffering, their faces lit by torches like demons celebrating in hell. Stones flew from angry hands, while curses filled the air like toxic smoke. The stretcher-bearers pushed through narrow alleys as citizens poured from their homes despite the early hour. News of Robespierre's fall travelled faster than flame through dry timber. The man who had terrorized Paris for months now bled like any other mortal, his mythology dissolving in the face of human frailty. His final hours had only just begun, and already the psychological torment exceeded anything he had inflicted upon his victims. The architect of systematic terror was discovering that justice, when it finally arrives, carries interest compounded by every moment of suffering he had caused others. They hauled him to an emergency medical station in the Tuileries, where an army surgeon examined the wreckage of what had once been the most feared face in France. The jaw was shattered in 3 places, several teeth completely gone, his tongue nearly severed by the force of the blast. Yet his brain remained intact, ensuring that Maximilien Robespierre would live to experience every moment of his approaching execution. The surgeon worked by flickering candlelight, cleaning the wound with raw spirits that sent fresh waves of agony through his destroyed face. They stitched his tongue back together with thread torn from a tablecloth, bound his jaw with strips of cloth that quickly turned crimson with seepage. This was field medicine for a man who had once dined off porcelain plates while signing death warrants. The guards watched every movement of the surgeon's hands, ensuring that no mercy would be shown to the architect of mass murder. Even medical care became another form of torture, each procedure prolonging his suffering rather than ending it. As dawn broke over Paris on July 28th, they transported him to the Committee of Public Safety, the very office where he had orchestrated months of systematic killing. The irony was so complete, it felt like divine intervention. They placed him on the same table where he had reviewed execution lists with his morning coffee, where he had marked names for death with the casual efficiency of a clerk processing invoices. His own desk still held his papers, his signature visible on dozens of death warrants that would never be carried out. The room reeked of his own blood and fear, creating an atmosphere so thick with poetic justice that even his guards seemed unnerved by the symbolism. Here was the man who had transformed this space into the nerve center of revolutionary terror, now lying broken and helpless on furniture stained with his own suffering. his one functioning eye took in every detail of his former command center. Each familiar object now transformed into a monument to his fallen power. Paris awakened to chaos, unlike anything witnessed since the earliest days of revolution. Crowds gathered on every corner as news spread like wildfire through the districts. The leader of the terror had fallen, and the psychological release was immediate and overwhelming. People danced in streets where they had cowered for months. They sang songs that had been forbidden, pulled out bottles of wine hidden since the darkest days of revolutionary excess. Bakers opened their shops early, shopkeepers lifted shutters that had remained closed in fear. But the celebration carried an edge of hysteria, as if speaking too loudly might somehow resurrect the monster who had terrorized them. Citizens emerged from their homes like prisoners stepping into sunlight after years of darkness. The fear that had paralyzed Paris was lifting, but slowly, cautiously, as if the city itself was afraid to believe in its own liberation. Women who had whispered prayers in secret now shouted them from windows. Men who had hidden their true thoughts now proclaimed them in public squares. The trial that followed was revolutionary justice at its most efficient and brutal. Fouquier-Tinville, the public prosecutor who had sent thousands to their deaths at Robespierre's direction, now found himself processing the case of his former master. The outlawry decree meant no defense, no witnesses, no appeals for mercy, only verification of identity and confirmation of the death sentence that had already been pronounced. Robespierre could not speak in his own defense, even if the law had permitted it. His destroyed jaw made communication impossible, beyond scratched notes that his trembling hand could barely manage. Fouquier barely glanced at these pathetic attempts at written pleas. The same legal machinery that had condemned Marie Antoinette, Danton, and countless others now operated with mechanical precision against its own architect. Revolutionary justice moved swiftly when the creator of the system stood in the dock. The tumbril arrived at noon, the same wooden cart that had carried thousands to their appointments with death. They loaded Robespierre like cargo, his body too weak to sit upright without support against the side rails. The executioner's assistant helped him with professional courtesy, the kind of practiced gentleness that comes from handling human freight destined for slaughter. But Robespierre weighed less than expected, his frame hollowed out by months of stress and the consuming fire of his own paranoia. The crowd that gathered for his final journey was the largest Paris had seen in years. Every window, every doorway, every rooftop held spectators desperate to witness the fall of the man who had made their lives a daily gamble with death. Women screamed curses that had been bottled up for months. Men waved bloody rags like battle flags. Children hurled garbage with the enthusiasm of a festival. This was the same crowd that had once cheered his speeches, now transformed into a howling mob, thirsting for his blood more desperately than they had ever thirsted for bread. The procession crept through Paris with agonizing slowness, each jolt of the cart wheels over cobblestones sending fresh shocks of agony through his shattered face. The route had been carefully planned to maximize both humiliation and spectacle, winding through the city's busiest districts to ensure maximum exposure of the fallen tyrant. Every bump in the road, every stone in the street became an instrument of torture for a man who had shown no mercy to others in their final moments. Robespierre kept his eyes closed throughout most of the journey, perhaps unconscious from pain, perhaps simply unable to face the fury of the crowds he had once commanded. The man who had fed on public adoration like a drug now faced its opposite, the concentrated hatred of an entire city expressing itself in raw, primal screams for vengeance. The sound was deafening, a wall of human rage that seemed to press against the cart from all sides. They rolled past the house on Rue Saint-Honoré, where he had lived for 4 years, writing speeches and planning purges in a modest room that had become the nerve center of revolutionary terror. Someone hurled a bucket of pig's blood at the windows, red streaks trickling down the glass like tears of accusation. His former landlord, Duplay the carpenter, who had treated Robespierre like a son, peered from behind a curtain with the expression of a man watching his own nightmare come to life. Revolutionary friendship proved as fragile as morning frost when the guillotine called. The same neighbors who had protected him, who had shared their meals and their revolutionary fervor, now watched his destruction with the cold satisfaction of spectators at a public entertainment. The personal bonds that had sustained him through his rise to power dissolved instantly in the acid of fear and self-preservation. The crowd thickened to crushing density as they approached the Place de la Révolution. Perhaps 20,000 bodies packed around the execution site, creating a human amphitheater for the final act of revolutionary drama. Vendors hawked food and drink to spectators who had claimed viewing positions hours earlier. Death drew commerce the way honey draws flies, and entrepreneurs of all kinds had descended on the scene to profit from the public appetite for vengeance. At 2:30 in the afternoon, they hauled him up the scaffold steps to face the machine he had helped perfect. The guillotine waited with mechanical patience, its blade gleaming in the afternoon sun like a smile of steel. The crowd surged around the platform in waves of humanity, 15,000 throats baying for the blood of the man who had spilled so much of theirs. The sound was beyond human, a roar that seemed to rise from the earth itself. Executioner Sanson, with practiced efficiency born of countless repetitions, ripped away the bandages from Robespierre's jaw. The sudden exposure of his raw wound to air and sunlight sent a scream through his throat that cut through the crowd's roar like a blade through silk. Then came silence, perfect and icy, as his head settled into the lunette. Even 20,000 voices fell still in that moment of ultimate anticipation. An assistant pinned his shoulders while another secured his legs. The ritual was familiar, performed 1,000 times before with the same mechanical precision. Sanson checked his equipment one final time, ensuring that the blade would fall cleanly and efficiently. The crowd held its collective breath as the man who had perfected the machinery of death took his place within it. Robespierre's eyes opened one final time, clear and aware despite his agony. He saw the crowd, the blood-stained platform, the blade poised above his neck. Understanding flooded his face in that last moment, the complete comprehension of his position in the machine he had built. The architect of terror finally understood the true nature of the system he had created, not as an instrument of justice, but as a hungry beast that would eventually devour even its own master. The blade fell with the whisper of steel through air, and Paris exploded in celebration unlike anything the city had ever witnessed. And so ended the 24 hours that transformed the architect of terror into its final victim. The blade that severed Robespierre's head also severed the spine of the terror itself, releasing France from the grip of systematic murder that had consumed the nation for over a year. But the true horror of his final day was not the guillotine's swift justice. It was the slow psychological destruction that preceded it, the methodical stripping away of power, dignity, and hope that revealed the ultimate price of wielding absolute authority over human life. In those final hours, Maximilien Robespierre experienced every form of suffering he had inflicted upon others, compressed into a single day of unbearable agony. The paranoia, the betrayal, the physical torment, the crushing realization that no escape existed, all of it served as perfect recompense for the thousands who had endured the same horrors at his command. His death proved that revolutionary justice, when it finally turns upon its creators, extracts payment with compound interest for every moment of terror they have authored. The man who had proclaimed himself incorruptible was corrupted by power so completely that he became the very monster he claimed to fight. His final 24 hours stand as history's most vivid reminder that those who feast on human suffering will eventually find themselves on the menu. The terror died with its master, and France began to heal from wounds that would scar the nation for generations to come.